So you both mentioned how governments invent traditions and by doing so construct national heritage. What role do you think that national heritage plays regarding collective memory? And does national heritage manipulate collective memory?
I think there's a very deep connection, obviously, between national heritage and collective memory, because governments use national heritage to somehow anchor um, memory. By this, I mean governments present the past in very physical forms, in visual forms, and this is the main role of heritage, to present a certain vision of the past in a way that citizens can consume it by visiting those places or by visiting museums. So obviously they are very strongly connected, but at the same time, heritage can also shape memory. Think about how selective heritage is. What do we register as national heritage in any country? Do we register all the things of value that we have inherited from past generations? Obviously not. We register some of those, and the process itself is selective and by definition not entirely objective. The scope, the objectives of each generation might change over time in what they define or what they seek through a national heritage. So this is what I mean through the very selective nature of heritage. And then it immediately follows that memory is also selective. What do we remember and what do we forget from
Yeah.
our history? And I thought about an example to just give you an idea of how selective this process is. During the Pak Chong-yi era, most of the historic sites that were being restored or actually almost reconstructed entirely were connected to Imjinweran, so to the Japanese invasions of the late 16th century. It was a battle of the invasion of Hideyoshi's troops in the Korean peninsula, and is a historical event that could be very easily used by the Pak Chong-gi government to represent the heroic nature, the fierce nature of Koreans who fought their enemies. And that logic was transported into everyday life in the 1960s and 1970s. Citizens should engage in the battle of modernization of the fatherland, just as in the past Koreans had fought their Japanese enemies. So Imjinweran was so often commemorated that at some point one coordinator from the Office of Cultural Properties, the national office which was managing heritage, he said that it was like reinventing, bringing back to life Imjinweran. We were bringing it back to life. But at the same time, for instance, the colonial period was not commemorated. And my understanding of it is that it was too close in time and it could have been too divisive, so create too many conflicts among citizens, as maybe arouse them, give somehow some social space for dialogue about the colonial period, and the regime did not want that. So they avoided commemorating colonial independence fighters, with very, very, very few exceptions. So you see, in the same regime selected one event and somehow neglected another, and they were both connected to Japan.
I think this collective memory, of course, is a modern concept, but as a process, it's been going on forever. Yeah, so it's very layered. Yeah. So if you look, for example, at the adoption of, to talk about Confucian academies, so it's a Chinese concept that comes to Korea in the 16th century, and in the 16th century, Koreans start to build these Chinese or build academies after a Chinese model. But of course, they're also at this point very collective in what they choose, very selective, to use that word, very selective in what they choose, what is their idea of a Chinese academy, or how they think a Chinese academy should be like. So this process has been going on for such a long time that sometimes it's very difficult to see what layer we are at. Yeah. So I think this is something, sometimes the problem with collective memory, to deal with it, like, okay, where does it come from? Where is this taken from? Is it completely invented, or is this picking up on something else that existed before? And this sometimes seems very difficult to me when I deal with this this concept. I looked at it a little bit because the question came up in the questions you sent me, and I thought that what it was first, the concept when it was first developed, it was also a reaction to these essentialist descriptions of saying, okay, Koreans think like that because they are Koreans. Yeah, to say like, okay, this is kind of their way of thinking. So in order to explain why there is a certain Korean shared identity, or how this Korean identity is constructed, this collective memory idea was brought up. So it constructs itself out of these and these and these points. Of course, and that's, I think, very important to make here again, is that collective identity exists, but also on different layers again. So you have a collective memory or identity in your family that you share, or in your in different groups. So it's like everybody sees this academy and has exactly the same idea about it, saying, oh, it's like the great Confucian past of or the great Confucian past of Korea, but different identities. But of course, the narrative that is the government has a strong, I guess, power to manipulate these ideas through history education, through just the promotion of this heritage, as Conchita mentioned, and also towards tourists. Yeah, if you come and you've been told, okay, this is an ancient university, this is a place where people studied, then of course you have a different understanding. You connect it in your head with, okay, this is a place of studying, and then of course this shapes your idea of what it would be, or how you see the place very much.
When it comes to traditional buildings like Hanok or Confucian academies, is there a way to differentiate fake from authentic? What does authenticity require? Are there any essential features or characteristics?
Yeah, the authenticity question is very difficult. I think to make it easy, I think the UNESCO, to go from the UNESCO point of view, and it's a little bit to the next question too, is I think the whole UNESCO Convention of World Heritage originally, of course, is a Western concept. It comes from Europe mostly, and it was designed to adhere to the iconic European ideas of what heritage is. So it was, this authenticity was very much, okay, this is really old. Yeah, it was used. The stones are the same as before. And that didn't really fit for a long time with East Asian ideas of architecture, for example. Yeah, because if you have a Confucian academy, or if you have a building that's built by wood, it's pretty easy to put it down and build it somewhere else. And it was done very often. Yeah, that like a beam had to be replaced at one point, or the kiwa, the roof tiles had to be replaced and stuff like this. So they were constantly renewed. And sometimes maybe there was a flooding, so a whole academy was moved from one place to another. And so I think the solution that was found for this, that in 1994, I think the NARA document on authenticity was reevaluated, and it's no coincidence that this was done in Japan, because the Japanese were driving at this point to try to register many of their temples, and these are done with wood. So I think these new guidelines on what authenticity actually is are very very flexible, I would say. Yeah, it's like it has to be in itself whole. Yeah, it has to be to the purpose and the culture that it existed. It still has to kind of adhere to that one. If you read through these guidelines for authenticity. So, but I would say that's actually a good thing. Yeah, it's because of course if you go to the cathedral in Cologne, it's built over 1,000 years, and there's stones from that time and stones from that time. But of course we view it as okay, this is will stand forever and is authentic. But like if you can tear down a building and build it up somewhere else, like you could with an Hanok, is it then still authentic or is it not anymore? And that's a big question. Yeah, so I would actually say this new ideas of being a little bit more flexible with the application of the term authentic is pretty useful in the term of national heritage, especially in East Asia.
What the NARA document on authenticity did was to create a new framework on how we define actually, and it integrated the spirit of communities. It said, so what, not just the object itself, like the building, but how the people built that specific building. How what functions that specific building had for the people. And a lot of the new understanding of authenticity relied on traditions that came, as Martin said very well, from outside Europe, mostly from East Asia and Southeast Asia, where the climate makes materials decay. So what do you do with a temple that decays? You rebuild it and you use new materials. Does it mean that it's not authentic anymore? Well, if you integrate the community which takes care of that building and which replaces the wood in that temple ritually, based on a ritual long, hundreds of years long, if you take this into consideration, then that space is still authentic because it has integrated the rules of the community, the traditions of the community. And as you know, in Korea right now, there are many reconstructions taking place. The most obvious is the Gyeongbokgung Palace, which has been reconstructed since the 1990s, since 1990 actually. It's the largest project of reconstruction in South Korea right now. And Sungnemun is another notable example. The gate, also you might also know it as Namdaemun, the south gate of the former fortress wall in Seoul. It burned in 2008 and had to be reconstructed. And the idea of infusing authenticity in this reconstruction was to use people who know how to work with wood in the traditional way. And these people themselves are registered as intangible heritage.
If we go, or if you ever have the chance to go to Tosan, so the Tosan Academy close to the city of Andong is where most Korean students have to go once in their lifetime, because it was mostly promoted already in the 70s, which I would say, which was one of the 9 academies that was nominated and is now UNESCO World Heritage. But if you actually go there and if you learn about the history of the academy, I would say this academy is nearly completely rebuilt. Yeah, during the Park Chung-hee times, they built a wall around it. They fashioned it in a design that was considered at that time to be reflective of Confucian architecture or Korean architecture. And in the middle, if you go in, it's very interesting. If you go into the academy, in the middle there is a museum that is basically made out of concrete. Yeah, in the middle of the academy, you have a museum where you go in and you learn of the history of the academy. So I always wonder how this academy got actually nominated or actually got to be Confucian or World Heritage, because it is completely rebuilt, I would say. Yeah, there's of course there's probably some wood or some structures that are the same, and the idea, the architectural idea probably of the buildings is still similar, but it's very much an example of this, how this idea of authenticity can be spun into whatever you want in that sense. And I think the reason it got nominated is because it's an important academy. It was always an important academy. So it is political an important academy. Yeah, it has a big community. What is the most interesting thing I thought about the South Korean nomination of these 9 academies is not so much which ones were rebuilt or which ones were like reconstructed or not. It's which ones were actually chosen, because you have so many that are rebuilt and so many that are new. But which ones do they choose? They chose the one that were important already during the Joseon dynasty.